podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidelminicast. And now, Scott Clark.
Are theological seminaries a tool of the devil? Stand by for the shocking truth.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92026.
My dear friend Angela sent me an electronic communication in which she asked, how would you respond to Vodi Bachum's take on seminaries? And you say, Clark, of what do you speak? And the reason that I say what I do is because Angela pointed me to this.
And I'm afraid that in this culture where we have the luxury of so many seminaries, what that's done is it's put us in an environment where we believe it's the seminary's responsibility to train the next generation of ministers. That's a lie from the pit of hell.
Well, that's always a useful way to begin a dialogue by accusing people who disagree with you of being from the pit of hell. So, no, I don't think it is. I think good people, reasonable people, godly people, Christian people, educated people can disagree about this. And I didn't hear any more of the clip than that. The link that Angela sent to me was from another podcast, and that is all that he played. The podcast is one with which I'm not familiar. Be Wise is the name of the podcast, and I don't know it. I don't know the host. I take it he's a pastor. And anyway, he goes on to talk about disciples and to equate training pastors with training disciples. And I would distinguish between those two things. Obviously, all pastors are disciples, but not all disciples are pastors. I think that would be a useful distinction. All pastors are disciples, but not all disciples are pastors. The evidence for every member ministry, if that's an assumption that's going on here, the evidence in Scripture is very weak indeed. There's almost no evidence at all that laity practiced ministry in the New Testament, despite the industry that has developed to promulgate the idea of every member ministry. The actual exegetical biblical basis for it is very thin. Now, I do believe and have argued and written articles in defense of the notion that every member should be able to give witness to the faith. But as I keep saying, evangelism proper is something that the ordained minister does. In the proclamation of the gospel, the official proclamation of the gospel, in the conduct of the ministry, the official ministry of the institutional church.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.
Now, as to the business of who should be educating pastors, well, it happens in steps. And there's a history to this question. And I don't know what Vodi knows about the history of education, but this is something to which I've given some attention because I get this question all the time, this objection that, seminaries are creating liberals, or they go liberal, or they're not preparing men for pastoral ministry. And that's one of the objections that the host of the podcast made, that many have told him that they came out of seminary ill-prepared for pastoral ministry. And, my response, a little bit cheeky, but I mean it. It's because it may be, let me put it that way, it may be, I'll put on my responsible and careful hat here, as opposed to the bombastic podcast host hat, that some people are not going to very good seminaries. And there is a great winnowing of seminaries, I think underway, and it's only going to get worse. The demographics are against seminaries. The baby boom is well over, and enrollments are dropping across the board. And it's going to be a very challenging time because a lot of these institutions developed in the post-World War II era when there were, more students than churches and more graduates than churches. And now there are more churches than graduates. And congregations are having a difficult time. And so that's partly demographics. We're just not replacing ourselves. We're not having babies in this country at a sufficient rate, I guess. And then not to make the podcast episode too dark, but there's the sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that is Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton. And under that regime, last estimate, it's been a little while since I counted the numbers, but the number that comes to mind is, 73 million or something like that, human beings that were not born in this country, which is a significant thing. So anyway, for a variety of reasons, the whole business of educating pastors is changing, and seminaries are struggling. Some very large schools that had an enormous number of students once upon a time are now struggling to stay afloat. And so anyway, as to whether seminaries are a tool of the devil, well, obviously there are good seminaries and there are bad seminaries. And then, of course, there's the question of whether there should be seminaries at all. And the answer to that is yes, there should be. And here's whence they came. You might not know this. Lots of people don't know this. A seminary is essentially a theological faculty in exile. So in the Middle Ages, and I'll go back and tell a more complete story in a second, but in the Middle Ages, there were multiple faculties in the university from the 12th and 13th centuries forward. And so the principal faculty was the theological faculty. And that's because theology was considered queen of the sciences. It was the highest form of knowledge. Then there was the arts faculty, and there was a medical faculty, and there was a law faculty. So there were 4 faculties in the university. And again, when I say the word university, you mustn't think of, University of Michigan or UCLA or Texas or someplace like that where you've got 50 or 100,000 students, or even my alma mater, the University of Nebraska. We'll just let this ride for a minute. After all, what else have you got to do but listen to Hail Varsity? Is this not awesome? Yes, indeed. If you've not seen the Pride of Nebraska performing Hail Varsity in front of 76,000 or more now, sometimes 90,000. But when I was a boy, Memorial Stadium held 76,000 faithful, and it was like they're headed back to that number. But anyway, it just gives me goosebumps. Football season is only about 100 days away. Anyway, you can't think of these giant modern universities with these marvelous theme songs, fight songs, like the University of Nebraska's Hail Varsity. So you think of a small Christian college, really. So this faculty where I teach, we have 11 people, and or so, maybe 12. I don't know. I should count, but 11 or 12 people, and we would be considered about the same size, really, as the medieval universities. And we're a pretty small school, medium size, I guess, but relatively small, tiny compared to a modern university. So that's why I make that point. We use these words, and they have different connotations for us than they did in the Middle Ages. So from where did these different faculties come? Well, let me tell you a story about the history of education. So school used to be done initially on a private basis. Very few people actually went to school, and only the wealthy, typically, unless a boy and girls didn't much get education formally, and a boy would get a scholarship from from the town or from a patron or something. But otherwise, you had to come from some money to be able to hire a tutor to come to your house and to educate you and teach you your letters. And in the Greco-Roman world, that meant learning Greek and Latin. And by the way, learning Greek and Latin at the point of a switch is how it was done. And so there was right. This is antiquity. That's why Paul uses the word paidagogos in Galatians 3 to talk about the law, because everybody knew in the ancient world that is how education is done. You memorized your vocabulary and your forms and all the other things you were supposed to memorize, and you recited correctly and you translated correctly. And if you didn't do it, you got a switch across the back of the hands or somewhere else. That is how education was done until about 1974, actually, is when the wheels formally really began to come off, or really came off. They began to come off a little earlier than that. But at any rate, so you'd start off with a private tutor, and then you might go see a teacher, and you might study with a small group of students with a tutor or a teacher. And then there were, of course, from the New Testament, from the book of Acts, there's the lecture hall of Tyrannus. So that that indicates maybe some kind of group education, but certainly education wasn't done the way we do it today, which is essentially a 19th century factory model. We build a building, and we equip it with bells, and you sit in a room for 50 minutes or however long you do, and the bell rings, then you get up and you go to the next room, the next station. That's what I call that, the factory model of education. That isn't how education was done for a very long time. It's a very modern approach to education, and it has its pluses and minuses. I'm not a big fan, which is why we homeschooled, to opt out of the factory model altogether and to go back to some version of the tutorial model. Anyway, so as you go off then to eventually to a kind of a grammar school, maybe, as I indicated, and then when you would go to something like what we think of as university or college, they didn't exactly exist, but by the time you get to the early Middle Ages, you'd go to a cathedral school. And that was, again, a small school, a regional school associated, as the name indicates, with a local cathedral, with a local bishop. And there, the local teacher, or the teacher in the cathedral school, would cover everything, would cover, and there were really only two major disciplines that were being studied in the cathedral schools: arts, when you think of maybe the English department in your local school, and theology.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
One of the most famous such teachers in a cathedral school is Anselm of Canterbury. And so if you look at the intellectual product of such teachers, you'll see that they wrote lots of handbooks on logic and even on how to make your letters, and on reasoning, dialectic. Well, I guess that'd be logic. Now, grammar, that was the other thing I was searching for. And so you'd see a collection of textbooks associated with such teachers, and then you'd see theology textbooks. And after a while, there's a longer story that could be told about those schools, but they had certain weaknesses. One is that one guy had to do everything, and the demands became more and more. And so gradually there developed distinct faculties. And so by the time you get to the 12th and 13th centuries, you see in places like Paris and Oxford gatherings of monastic scholars, and they formed colleges or faculties. Well, they did both. They formed colleges, that is a place where you could live. Think of kind of dormitory. It's more than that. But it included a residence typically, and then the distinct faculties began to develop. So you had scholars who were devoted specifically to the law. So you had a degree of professionalization, and scholars devoted specifically and solely to theology, and scholars devoted specifically and solely to the arts and to the law. So law, medicine, arts, and theology. Those are the four faculties. So that was the way that education was done. And if a young man wanted to enter into the ministry, he obviously would be educated to a certain degree in the basics of the Christian faith and discipled in the church, but then sent off to, university. And so, as I say, tutored at home and then grammar school and then university. And because there was not a lot of wasted time and not a lot of standing in line, the young men would go off to university at about the age that we normally send children to middle school or maybe high school. So that it would not be unusual for a young man to go off to university at age 14 or 15, something like that. And maybe a little bit later than that sometimes. But that's why, Philip Melanchthon was, in the 16th century, was petitioning for his master's degree from the university at some very, even they thought it was too young, unreasonable age. I think it was at the University of Heidelberg. And my recollection is, and I haven't looked this up for a while, but he was something like 12. So they said, no, we're not giving a master's degree to a 12-year-old or however old he was. And he had to go to another school, which did grant him a master's degree. He was precocious, to say the least. But at any rate, that's why people were so young. If you look at the history of some figure, you're reading a biography and you see he went off to university at some what seems to us unreasonable age, it isn't necessarily the case that he went off because he was a genius, although he might have been. It's just that there was a lot less wasted time. As my dear friend Kathy once said to me, we were talking about our history of public school, and she said most of public school education is standing in line and crowd control. And as soon as she said that,
Sabotucci's, column fives, spies. Truth is stranger than fiction. Is everybody dumb? He's talking pig Latin. I don't know what he's saying.
The Heidelcast.
my entire education made sense.
When I think back on all the I learned in high school, it's a wonder I can think at all.
So here's the deal. We have been sending young people to university, to the theology faculty in the university, after discipling them in the church for a long time. This isn't something that was just recently invented. And maybe more fundamentally than that, it has been the goal, desire, plan, intention of the historic Christian church to have an educated ministry. But there's a lot of opposition to that notion in America for a variety of reasons, cultural reasons, historical reasons. Most American evangelicals who are opposed to, real education of ministers come out of fundamentalism because they don't trust institutions. And so there's that part of the picture. It's also because they haven't themselves valued education. They're suspicious of educational institutions. And so that goes back to the early 19th century, that sort of radical democratizing, lowercase d, radical egalitarian ethos, lowercase e, has a suspicion of education. But in the Reformation churches and in the medieval churches out of which we came, we always, and then going back to the early patristic period, if you read the literature of the fathers, you can tell which of them are laymen. For example, read First Clement. He is a layman, in my opinion. I don't think there's any question about that. He's not, uneducated, but he's not theologically educated. Compare him to Polycarp, and the differences are stark. If Clement thinks about natural things, uses natural analogies, doesn't really know Scripture very well, and only makes a passing reference to what we think of as the doctrine of free justification. It's good, it's sound what he says, but it's very brief and really only a passing reference. Whereas, if you look at Polycarp, by contrast, he's thinking about the gospel all the time. He's thinking about Christ all the time. He knows the scriptures. He thinks theologically. And so you can just tell by the quality of the text, the qualities inherent in the writing, that one has a formal education in theology and the other one does not. And you can see that, Ignatius of Antioch is formally theologically educated. And, there are other texts that are collected in the Apostolic Fathers that are pretty clearly written by amateurs. The shepherd of Hermas would be one that comes to mind right away. Or maybe I should just say Hermas, shepherd of Hermas, sometimes just called Hermas. At any rate, you can see that there are, in the earliest post-apostolic days of the church, educated pastors. And we had educated pastors all through the history of the church, and certainly the Reformation churches had educated pastors. And among the Anabaptists, however, that was mixed. In fact, a lot of the leaders were laity, or sort of elevated, if you will, or appointed to pastoral office who didn't necessarily have education. Now, there were educated Anabaptists and some major figures. Menno Simons comes to mind. Balthasar Hubmaier would be another. And there were several others, so not to say there weren't any. But there was, again, this radical egalitarian democratizing movement among the Anabaptists that sort of militated against education and was suspicious of it. So when the Enlightenment took over, captured the university, that created a crisis because the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th century said, well, all this supernatural stuff is fine if you want to, believe it privately, but don't claim it as objective history or objective fact, because we know how the world works, and we know a priori these things don't happen. Floods, parting of the Red Sea, a fellow being raised from the dead. That's not how the world works. That's not how enlightened people think. So if you want to believe this stuff and it helps get you through the night, as one of my undergraduate profs used to say, which is not original to him. I think it's the Beatles, but he used to say, whatever gets you through the night. But what he was saying is, don't expect me to treat it as a rational truth claim about objective reality. So gradually, as the Enlightenment ethos took over, the universities captured the universities, much in the way that DEI and before that deconstructionism and these sort of radical subjectivist movements have captured the university in our time. The Enlightenment captured the universities in their time. And so that put the theology faculties in a difficult position. Either they conformed to the Enlightenment or they had to go into exile. And so, for example, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, tensions at Princeton Theological Seminary grew and grew between three groups. There were liberals, moderates, and conservatives or confessionalists. And eventually the moderate evangelicals and the liberals agreed, more or less, against the confessionalists, and J. Gresham Machen and some of his colleagues left Princeton in 1929 and formed essentially a theological faculty in exile. Now, obviously, PTS, Princeton Theological Seminary, was already a sort of a distinct institution within the university, but it was functionally the theology faculty. In the universities in Europe, for example, Leiden, where they had Orthodox theologians before Arminius in the early 17th century. That was the seminary, and it was a faculty of the University of Leiden, and that was true in Heidelberg and many other places, Oxford and Cambridge and so on. And so that's where the education of pastors was done. And we only have seminaries now because, independent seminaries now, because they've been exiled from the university. But we still fulfill the same function. Because of the nature of the university today, we can't be reintegrated into them. But the pattern still holds. Young men are identified in the church. They're discipled in the church. They're catechized in the church. People, they've been baptized and they've made profession of faith. They've been nurtured in the church. And then, as has been done for centuries and centuries and centuries, they are, in effect, sent off to university to get an education, because it is not the church's vocation to teach nature. And again, maybe the big point here is that the comments that Vodi made reflect the refusal or the inability to distinguish between nature and grace.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
So what happens in the church is that the supernatural or grace is the focus, as it should be. And so young people are taught the history of redemption, the Christian vocabulary, the basics of the faith, the Apostles' Creed, the Confession of the Church, so the Westminster Shorter Catechism, the Heidelberg Catechism, or whatever it may be. Those are the things, right, that the church is equipped to teach. But the church, as an institution, isn't equipped and isn't called to teach Greek, Hebrew, Latin, if we were doing things properly, right? We go back to the old model, the Renaissance model. You learn all three languages. In fact, you should be doing that before you get to seminary. When Westminster Seminary was formed in 1929, the assumption was that you would do Greek and Hebrew before you got to seminary because you're going to have a good undergraduate education. And of course, that assumption hasn't been valid for a long time. It was just given that you would have Latin. Right? They didn't even have to stipulate that because all educated people until basically World War II learned Latin in school because you can't really understand English properly until you've got some Latin. And once you have Latin, you can learn Greek very quickly, very easily, because Greek is just Latin with funny letters. It works the same way. So, that was the way things were done, and quite rightly so, because the understanding was implicitly, and I'm going to make it explicit, that it is the function of the school, of the university, to educate students in nature. And learning Greek is a function of nature. Learning Hebrew is a function of nature. Learning Latin is a function of nature. So all those things belong to nature. Learning history is really a function of nature more than grace. Now, there are obviously aspects of ministerial education that more directly touch the church. Homiletics, preaching, and what we call practical theology, which is a modern category. Pastoral theology would be the same thing. Those obviously are more closely integrated to the life of the church. But a lot of what is done in a theology faculty or a seminary belongs under the heading of nature rather than grace. Show me in the New Testament where the church is commissioned to teach Greek, Hebrew, Latin, history, and a lot of the things that are done in the seminary. You can't show that to me because it doesn't exist, because the assumption was these are the kinds of things that people learned in school. Even, the Apostle Paul studied with a rabbi, and he obviously is very well educated. He didn't learn all that he learned in the church. So that's another problem to this paradigm, the failure to distinguish between nature and grace. So seminaries certainly do have a place in the life of the church. Very few congregations are equipped to prepare men for pastoral ministry. We tried this in the 19th century on the frontier, and in the 18th century, it did not go well at all. It was a disaster, which is why the Law College was formed, and then just to think about the Presbyterian experience in the New World, and why Princeton Seminary was established in 1812 to remedy exactly the kind of thing that people are counseling that we should do today. Again, and this gets back to education. If the people who are opposed to seminaries knew more about the history of education and more about the history of theological education, even in the United States, they would know better than to prescribe the kinds of things that they are prescribing.
The best podcast, the Heidelminicast.
Pastors need face-to-face education from professional vocational scholars today. I'm talking to you in 2024. For the very same reason they needed it in the Middle Ages, for the very same reason that theology faculties, arts faculties, medical faculties, law faculties began to develop in the high Middle Ages, 12th and 13th centuries, and for the very same reason that Princeton was established in 1812, it's because the local pastor is not equipped to do that kind of work, to teach Greek, to teach Hebrew, to teach Latin, to teach ancient Near Eastern studies, to be expert in New Testament studies, to be expert in pastoral theology, practical theology, church history, and all the things that have to, systematic theology. And by the way, if a pastor tells you that he's expert in all these things and that you don't need to go to seminary, that's prima facie evidence that he doesn't know what he's talking about, and that you shouldn't trust him to educate you, because there isn't anybody who is expert in all these things and who in himself, or even with the help of a couple of friends, can replace an entire trained, educated, prepared collection, faculty of pastor scholars. Just can't be done.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
The best podcast, the Heidelminicast.